Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody to the UCF Insight Seminar Series for Fall 2021. As you might know, UCF is part of the DHS National Counterterrorism Innovation Technology and Education Center, which is housed out of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. As part of our partnership with NCITE, we have an ongoing seminar series where we welcome some of the best and brightest minds in the Homeland Security enterprise. And they range from academics to practitioners and law enforcement officers. And today we're very lucky to have Elizabeth Newman here, who's certainly spanned the gambit. Her prior work at DHS to now where she's at Moonshot. And so, I think one of the things that we're very excited about having Ms. Newman here is, given the amount of relevancy to online social media today and the rise of extremism, Moonshot really does play a special place in sort of trying to address this radicalization process. So a little bit of information about Ms. Newman. She's the Chief Strategy Officer at Moonshot, a social enterprise working to end online harms such as violent extremism, disinformation, child sexual exploitation, gender-based violence, and human trafficking by applying evidence, ethics, and human rights. Ms. Newman was recently serving as the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at DHS, where she led 8 program and policy teams addressing a range of issues, including domestic violent extremism, screening and vetting, counterterrorism, and transnational organizations, criminal organizations. I can certainly imagine we're going to have a lot of questions regarding your prior work and certainly what you're doing now. So I'm very excited about that. You might have seen Ms. Newman on television. She's been on CNN, MSNBC, PBS, NPR, 2020, 60 Minutes, all over the place. And she's a national board member on the National Immigration Forum and founder and member of the Council on National Security and Immigration and a national security contributor at ABC News. So with that, we're about to hand it off to Ms. Newman, but of course, with every presentation, we have a little caveat. So while this seminar is sponsored by DHS, it in no way represents the views, opinions, or policies of DHS or the US government. And I can say certainly that is true for UCF. After I hand it off to Ms. Newman, we're going to let her speak for a little bit of time. And then afterwards, we'll open it up for Q&A. And we really want to encourage a healthy discussion here. So feel free to participate. All questions are welcome. We're just going to ask that if you could type the gist of your question to me. And then what we'll do is that will allow me to moderate and sort of unmute people, and they can ask their question directly to Ms. Newman. And, we welcome a dialogue in that process. So with that, I am going to hand it off. Feel free to start sharing your screen.
Well, good morning, everybody. Or good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's afternoon here, but if you're out in Nebraska, which is, good part of the country, then good morning. My husband is actually a native of Nebraska, so I've been to an actual experience of a football game, which is unlike any other. It's really an honor actually to be a part of the kickoff of this conversation, and was really excited to see when the university won the Center of Excellence from DHS. So I'm really looking forward to the work that you guys are going to be contributing to in this field, which is definitely nascent and growing. And I'm just going to look at Aiden real quick and say, can you give me a thumbs up, Aiden, that the sharing of the screen is working the way it's supposed to? Awesome. We practiced this beforehand because I have to remember every time I do it. All right. So from there, you guys are studying this and probably have seen new and interesting insights. So I really am looking forward to hearing your questions and having some dialogue at the end. I'm going to share my perspective on things, and I am very much also learning. And I think that's actually kind of a good place to start. The place that we find ourselves when it comes to prevention is, I think, in the midst of quite a big transformation. If you look at what really is fairly recent history, when we were standing up the Department of Homeland Security, standing up all of the policy around how to make sure another 9/11 never happens again, the definition of prevention that President George W. Bush signed out as part of the Homeland Security Presidential Directive number 8 was very narrow. It said activities undertaken by the first responder community during the early stages of an incident to reduce the likelihood or consequences of threatened or actual terrorist attacks. More general and broader efforts to deter, disrupt, or thwart terrorism are not addressed in this directive. For those that were not participating in policy debates back then, I think it's kind of useful to remind everybody that in those early days, the concept of prevention was very much wrapped into offensive, things that the military did, intel community, things that law enforcement did. It was really not seen as a homeland security function, other than in this tiny little space of, oh, there might be a few things that first responders could do to mitigate the effects of a bomb that's about to go off. Or perhaps some of our local law enforcement and first responder community needs the ability to be trained on mitigating a bomb, or connecting intelligence to the FBI so that they can disrupt an attack. It was just very narrow in how they viewed prevention. So if you look at this slide that I have up here, on the far right of this slide where it says attempted attacks, and just to the left you see mobilization to violence. Back in 2003, it really was just the yellow bullet there, the attempted attacks that prevention occupied as a discipline. So we quickly learned that was not going to work. When I came back to government, I was out for about a 6-year period between 2011 and 2017. When I came back to government, the counterterrorism community was having this conversation. We have been at this for 15 years. We saw the 20-year mark on the horizon, and there are more terrorists today than there were 9/11. So even though we had protected the homeland from another attack on the size and scale of 9/11, which is not something to take lightly, that was not a given, but we certainly couldn't look at ourselves honestly and say we were winning. If you have more terrorists that and the threat had dispersed and metastasized, and it was global, and increasingly we were seeing things from a homegrown perspective. It just was it was a sobering moment to walk back in and realize that we were not winning. So we were having conversations about, what does that mean? What should we be doing differently? How do we actually address the root causes that are driving people to violence? And the truth is that the US government had tinkered around the edges of prevention for 10 or so years before 2017. The earliest onset of prevention efforts was around 2006, 2007 in Minnesota. There were teenagers or young men that were traveling to go to Africa to join al-Shabaab. And some of the Somali first generation parents were just, apoplectic and like, why are they doing this? And they had come to a few community roundtable conversations that DHS had sponsored. They had gone to the FBI trying to figure out how to prevent their youth from going overseas and joining terrorist groups. So there were a number of efforts that kind of came out of those initial conversations. You may have heard them: building communities of trust, countering violent extremism, where the government was trying to figure out how to work with the community to identify individuals that were radicalizing and try to get them help before they did something criminal. The challenge was most of these efforts were not funded significantly enough. So that's let's be honest about that. But they were also largely law enforcement driven, and a few locations where they were sponsored. Just speaking frankly, I think the wrong individuals or individuals that had a very aggressive approach to counterterrorism were put in charge of liaisoning with the community, and it created a lot of mistrust. It created this sense of, you don't actually want to help my child or help my friend. You're just trying to get your next tip or lead for your investigation. So that friction, whether it's right or wrong perception, really tainted a lot of those early CVE efforts. So much so that when I came into government in 2017, I was presented with an office that Secretary Jay Johnson had stood up, called the Office of Community Partnerships, which when you met the individuals running this, many of them who are still there, you would never in a million years think these are people that are trying to spy on Americans. But that was kind of the reputation they had for certain parts on the left, that whatever the government was trying to do with CVE, and again, this was under the Obama administration, it couldn't be trusted because they're just trying to target certain communities, predominantly the Muslim community, but also the Black community felt that they were being unfairly targeted by these efforts. On the right, you had a number of, I won't say congressmen as much as it's congressional staffers who were raising concerns that de-radicalization intervention doesn't work. This is pseudoscience. And I came to discover that a lot of the influence there probably had to do with some exposure that military men and women had overseas to intervention efforts that were occurring in the Middle East, many of which maybe were not framed the right way, and certainly many of which could not be exported to the United States. Their methods would never be tolerable here. So you had our military men and women who are held in very high esteem by all members of Congress, but especially on the right, coming back saying intervention doesn't work, de-radicalization doesn't work. And so there was a bit of this tension of, you're hearing a little bit of anecdotes from various parties and nobody quite knew who was telling the truth or who actually had the evidence to back them up. So for a lot of reasons, prevention was tinkered, played with, but not fully ever embraced. And that's where I showed up, and I didn't have enough background on any side to know who was right, who was wrong. So I did what a good policymaker does and punted. We had some extra money left over at the end of a fiscal year, and we asked Rand, who was serving as our FFRDC, to go study the problem. And they did. And they came back with a 300-page report that told us a couple of key things. It said prevention works. Now, before this, we didn't actually have any documentation from any reputable source that the government would accept, I should say, that was comprehensive enough to say prevention works. So that was kind of a very important moment. They pointed out that it needed to be locally driven. And a lot of what we had been doing as a government for 10 years was very DC driven. It was cases running out of DC, or DC dictating how to do prevention. So locally driven, and then it needed to be multidisciplinary. There was an undertone of moving it out of a law enforcement entity or a law enforcement driven approach, and that maybe it's best if somebody else is driving prevention capability, not that law enforcement doesn't have a role. And then the last key finding was it's not nearly resourced enough. Like, I don't remember the stat off the top of my head, but when you compare the amount of money that we have spent militarily, from an intelligence standpoint, from a law enforcement standpoint over 20 years post 9/11, the amount of money we are spending on what is classified as prevention is infinitesimally small. And there's enough evidence out there that speaks to the common sense wisdom that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So there was finally something documented that we could take to all of the voices that love to throw arrows at this program and say, no, we think we can actually do something good here. And of course, at the time that this was happening, you had the attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. We had the Las Vegas attack in October of 2017, which was never classified as terrorism, but man, was that not a terrorizing event, right? The experience for those that were there was absolute terror, even if it didn't meet the definition of terrorism. And we were moving into what would become in 2019 one of our most violent years for right-wing extremism, not just in the United States, but globally with the Christchurch attack. So we're in the midst of this moment where we recognize that the threat is getting worse. We're not entirely sure what's going on at the time because the government doesn't have good data, but we recognize we needed to do more than what we were doing. And so RAND kind of gave us this framework. We were able to take it to Congress, and Congress was able to say, yeah, now I should say it took a while to build back trust with members of Congress. They were not really thinking that they could trust somebody in the Trump administration, speaking frankly. So that was kind of a hurdle to overcome. And then DHS, just as an institution, has a history of not necessarily following through on things or being capable of executing. And that's not a slight on the people that are at DHS as much as it's an immature institution that's only 20 years old, and it's underfunded in so many places. So it took a while to build up that trust. The slide that you have in front of you is from the RAND study. And what it's laying out is that if you're going to intervene, you want to be as far left on this slide as possible. And when the farther left you go, the farther away you are from a criminal justice system. So if you are let's start on the right side where there's attempted attacks, that's clearly in a criminal justice responsibility if somebody has committed an attack. If you are in the process of mobilizing to violence, just moving a little bit to the left, there is absolutely a law enforcement role there to intervene, disrupt, and attack. But you move one more to the left, and you're dealing with radicalized individuals. That becomes, a little bit more of a gray area. And that's where we're running into problems. If you make it entirely law enforcement directed, quite frequently bystanders don't want to report. They don't want to report on their child or their loved one that, thinking like, well, I don't want them to end up in jail because I tattled on them, right? So there's this space where we know from evidence that bystanders can tell that something is going on with an individual, and we can intervene and possibly help them, but we don't currently have a system set up in this country where people know where they can go, where it's safe to ask for help. And also at the same time, whoever you're getting that help from needs to have the proper relationship with law enforcement such that if the individual has crossed a criminal threshold, you are able to easily refer them. And then you move one more to the left. So you're all the way on the left side of the screen where it says vulnerable population. This is an area where, and this maybe a public health model is a better way to describe some of this. We now understand that attackers have certain things in their backgrounds that make them vulnerable to that radicalization process. So if you can help shore up some of those vulnerabilities at a community-wide level, you are likely going to reduce the population of individuals that could be vulnerable to radicalization. So as I've walked through this, you kind of start to see that a lot of the things that need to be done, one, law enforcement's not best positioned to do it because we really don't want police officers involved in what is inherently non-criminal activity over on the left side. It's individuals that have risk factors in their background, are vulnerable for some reason, who need assistance. And I like to frame it more as let's recognize that these individuals, in many cases through no fault of their own, need help. And let's get them help as opposed to waiting for them to get to this place where they're mobilizing to violence. And then in our minds, they become the attacker, the evil person, and the only tool we have is criminal justice. So part of this switch that we're making as a country is out of necessity, but it's also extremely challenging because, quite frankly, over on this left side of the slide, we don't have enough resources. We don't have enough people in social services, mental health, behavioral health disciplines that, at least to the numbers that we need in order to be able to actually implement this system. So here's where we are. We documented a strategy in 2019. It's called the DHS Strategic Framework for Countering Terrorism and Targeted Violence. Goal 3 of that strategy lays out in great detail what we're trying to build out in the country from a prevention standpoint. It calls for states and local governments to build out this capability, much like we do in other Homeland Security preparedness disciplines. When we recognize that emergency communication wasn't working on the 9/11 response, there were efforts at the federal level to coordinate lessons learned and figure out what the standards need to be. But it's not the feds that are actually buying the radios and testing the radios and doing the communication. It's a local first responder. It's the firefighter group. It's the police officer group in a state or a city. And what does DHS do? They help set the standards, they convene, and then they enable through funding and advocacy. But the first responder is somebody in your neighborhood. It's your somebody that lives near you. It is not somebody in DC. Same thing with prevention. We don't want preventers coming out of Washington, DC. We want the first preventers to be the folks in your neighborhood, in your community, investing in making your community stronger. But the role of the feds is to help fund it and to help set those standards, making sure that we're achieving the best practices, learning from places where maybe we've made mistakes. And then we want the federal government to convene and advocate for this, but they are not the ones actually doing the first preventing. So the vision here laid out in the 2019 strategy, which by the way has been embraced by the Biden administration, is to build this capability out over a multi-year period. I think it's probably a 10-year process. It has definitely been interrupted by COVID, though. There were plans in 2020 to start doing kind of a big conversation with the states to get people's attention on this and to encourage certain states to be early adopters and start building out this capability. And unfortunately, that has been sidetracked. And I think we're at a place of trying to get things back on track and build that momentum. We will move off this slide shortly, but I'll close on the prevention primer, if you will. With the case of Colorado. They started their efforts it was very organic. It was the state starting to notice that they had a spate of attacks where people were calling the police saying, I'm concerned about this person. They're saying a few things like they're going to do something. So then the police would do what's called a knock and talk. They may even open a preliminary investigation. They really didn't have enough evidence to do anything. So they had to close the case. And sure enough, the individual goes and commits an attack and somebody dies. This happened 2 or 3 times. And the state was just kind of like, we've got to do something. The state also had the challenge of a number of school shootings. That Colorado, unfortunately, is known for that. And they were trying to figure out how they could take some of the lessons they learned from identifying a potential school shooter and intervening and trying to get them help earlier in the process. They were trying to take some of those lessons learned and apply it to a larger community setting. Likewise, the federal government had run into some problems where there were, I want to say it's 2015, 2016, there were some teenage girls that were trying to go overseas to join ISIS. And because they were teenagers, the government can't prosecute them. So you ended up with a situation where you're concerned that you have some teenage girls that are engaging in potentially, if they were adults, they could be prosecuted for material support to terrorism. But the way that the rules are structured, that the traditional criminal justice system was not open to them. So they too were looking for opportunities to be able to have alternatives to a traditional justice system. So the feds, the states happen to be seeing the same problem. They come together and they decide to partner with the University of Denver, which built a collaborative of mental health and behavioral health professionals. And they came through, it took them several years, but they started to piece together all of the different parts of capability that the state has through the social services, through civil society, and they trained these individuals on what the threat looks like. They trained them, they set up a referral system so that people both on the front line in social services, as well as people, the average citizen can have the ability to detect an individual that might be radicalizing or might be mobilizing to violence. They set up that referral system so that you could ask for help for an individual, and then they had a threat management, threat assessment process. So this intervention capability that they've set up is largely operating in the territory of Denver and a few other places. They're in the process of trying to move it to all of the jurisdictions in Colorado. They estimate it will take them 7 to 10 years to reach all of the partners in the state and truly institutionalize this prevention capability. So that gives you a sense of like how doing something new in a state environment. In Colorado's geographically large state, but population wise is, probably in the mid range for most of our states. So 7 to 10 years, this is not something that you just turn a light switch on. But in the 5 years that they've been doing this, they've facilitated over 1,200 interventions. 100 of those were individuals identifying with violent extremism ideology. So that means the bulk of the people they're intervening with are what we would classify as targeted violence. It could be domestic violence, it could be workplace violence, but it's not ideology as much as they just wanted to commit an act of violence. But of the 100 interventions for violent extremist ideology, 3/4 of them were associated with an anti-government extremist or a white supremacist ideology. So kind of some interesting findings there, and it gives us hope that over time and with the right investment and bringing this to scale, we might start to have at least the opportunity to reduce the amount of acts of violence that we're seeing in this country. I don't think that there's any one silver bullet here in this problem set, but certainly maybe moves us in a step in the right direction and takes some pressure off of the criminal justice system, which is also feeling very overwhelmed. Kind of moving to taking a step back away from prevention, just big picture. This is a slide from CSIS that kind of shows the different terrorist attacks and plots coming from different ideologies. The blue line represents what they classify as the violent far right. The red line is the religious ideology or influence. The key point here is you really kind of see that we've been so focused on Salafi jihadist inspired threats in the post 9/11 period, and reasonably so. What happened on 9/11 was devastating, but the threats and the plots that we've seen historically, and their data goes back to 1994, has come from that violent far right. And then you see that pretty big spike starting in 2015 and into 2020. The other, I think, key feature of some of the current threats that we're facing, there is a mixing of ideology happening that can make it difficult, especially if you're operating the way the media reports things, or you're trying to explain something to the media. People want to just be able to bucket it. Oh, okay, well, they had this ideology and that's why they committed this attack. And I'm sure many of you appreciate this from the when you dig into the details. Why somebody does something is often not fully straightforward. And the other piece of this is that when you start to see the mixing of ideology, one case stands out that we were meeting with U.S. attorneys for the domestic terrorism executive committee that they hold quarterly meetings over at DOJ, and my counterpart at NCTC and I were briefing them. And a U.S. attorney told this story of an individual that had joined a white supremacist group, had spent some time with them, left because they weren't violent enough, and then went to join ISIS. And you start to get first of all, you would think those ideologies contradict each other. There was another case that was prosecuted, maybe it hasn't been prosecuted. The indictment went down last year, so we're looking at court records, and they were, I want to say it was Boogaloo Boys, something domestic, that joined up with Hamas to get materials to commit whatever attack that they wanted to plot. So you're seeing this kind of willingness to kind of set aside whatever your core ideology is. Maybe it's a bit the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Maybe it's a bit of like the ideology doesn't matter at all. I just want to be violent. It's hard to say, and I'm sure the answer might be different depending on the person. But we're so prone, and for so long we're focused on the ideology, especially after 9/11, trying to understand why somebody would attack us, right? So like we're driven to really get into motivation and ideology. And what we have found is that when you study actual attackers, there are commonalities in their backgrounds, risk factors, vulnerabilities, and you start to realize that maybe the ideology is not nearly the driver as we think it is. I'm not saying it doesn't mobilize people, but what we think is actually underlying what drives somebody to join a group, that might be the more important thing for us to understand, because if we can address the unmet need or the grievance that's moving them to that violence in the first place, then we have the ability to perhaps prevent them from joining that group or move them away from that group, away from that violence, if we're actually addressing the core need. So I'll move on from this, and we can come back to it if anybody is interested in talking about it more. But I do think that there's a lot that we've learned so much in 10 years. We're so focused on counter narratives. And if you could explain why true jihad does not require violence, or if you could explain why this is a perversion of your scriptures, then we would be able to reduce the number of terrorists. And that, I'm not saying that's not an important feature of intervening in certain instances, but we've come to realize that the ideology seems to be less the key, and more important to focus on those other psychosocial factors that might be driving somebody to feel a need to join a group or mobilize to violence. Okay, this is kind of my intro slide to get to some of the Moonshot stuff and tell you a little bit about why I decided to join Moonshot. Director Ray asserted last year, earlier this year, terrorism moves at the speed of social media. And most law enforcement intelligence officials will tell you that most of our homegrown, even if it's international associated terrorism, but homegrown terrorism and domestic violent extremists largely are self-radicalizing online, and they mobilize to violence sometimes in a matter of weeks or days. It makes it extremely hard for law enforcement, therefore, to detect. I mean, that's one of the big shifts and the reasons prevention kind of had the opportunity to come to fruition. And I mean, no offense to my FBI partners, but if you've been around for 20 years, you know that the FBI loves to hog the football. And when it comes to counterterrorism, they love to be like, no, we're in charge. And it was only a few years ago, and I actually was in the room when somebody said this, and I almost was like, did the FBI actually say that they can't do it all, that they need help? And it was this realization that they just had too many cases moving too quickly and not enough tools especially when you're talking about the domestic environment, to go after it. And it's that opening that allowed us to say, well, maybe we can do something before the crime is committed. Maybe we can help individuals, prevent them from moving into that criminal space. The radicalization online is a key factor of why things have sped up. There is a significant difference statistically in the what we call the flash to bang, the moment that they radicalize to the moment they actually decide to commit an attack. That's a key challenge. And then just the amount of content that people can be exposed to so much more quickly than they could 10 years ago. So this data from START is actually 5 years old at this point. So I'm sure that it's really even more dramatic than this demonstrates. But the reason I love this graph is it shows you that everything flipped in about a 10-year period. So from 2005 to 2010, most people are being radicalized. 75% or so, there's no engagement with social media. It's all in person. They're sharing books and, maybe some video, but not through a social media context. Then you get to 2011 to 2016, and the primary and secondary role of social media makes up that 75%. So it's quite the dramatic change. And that's part of the reason that I think the counterterrorism community was a bit stunned at how dramatically the radicalization process sped up and how quickly these attacks started occurring. Which brings me to why I'm really excited to be with Moonshot. I think that every offline prevention effort needs an online prevention component, because that's actually where the radicalization is occurring. So that's not to say that we don't have offline in real life radicalization. It's just much smaller numbers, and it happens at a slower pace. So if you're trying to reduce the number of potential individuals of potential concern, then we've got to move prevention capability online. But you can't just stay online. And I'll talk a little bit about Moonshot's efforts and how we move to offline, but it's both, right? Like what we know about prevention, the way in which you get somebody to disengage is largely through another human being. It is through empathy, through understanding what's going on in their life. It's often through one-to-one counseling, but sometimes it's a family member, sometimes it's a friend, and it's helping that person re-engage with another human being in a healthier context than whatever group they had been associated with. So getting to that one-to-one connection is really key to actually seeing success in intervention. So let's talk about how Moonshot does online work, because often people can get fairly concerned that we're talking about tracking people, potentially invading, from a Fourth Amendment perspective, their rights. And one of the things that we do is we're looking, just like in an offline context, at behaviors, not individuals. So we're looking at risk searches, and what you're seeing on your screen are examples of people who are posting, engaging, sharing, or actively seeking hate, extremist, or terrorist content. So over the 6 years that Moonshot's been around, they have spent an enormous amount of time digging into what those keywords are that people search for, and figuring out we can actually quantify whether a certain search term is likely to be less risky than another search term. So this is just some of the examples of phrases that people might search. Now, what do we do with that? We're not actually tracking individuals, but we are able to track trends. During the election period, we examined trends of engagement with harmful content. All of these briefs, by the way, are available on our website, but it provides data down to a county level on the most popular search terms, the days when those terms spike, the risk that is most prevalent for that state, and the demographics of those searching for harmful content. All of what we're doing is civil liberties compliant. It involves no sharing of PII. It really is about helping security officials and quite frankly, the community understand the scale and geographies of audiences engaging in hate. when what Moonshot is known for is not just being able to do analysis. We're actually known for engaging with at-risk audiences online. So we can run targeted programs reaching directly out to audiences, engaging with extremist content. And our goal is to disrupt the spread of the content, to safeguard the user's journey, to support audiences that might be in moments of crisis, specifically de-escalating them from violence, and finally off-ramping them into real-world services, exit programs, or other interventions. In 2019, Moonshot tracked nearly 1 million attempts to access white supremacist content across the United States. That shifts in when the COVID pandemic hit and lockdown mitigation measures were put into place. We saw a 37% nationwide increase between February and May of 2020 as the pandemic spread. It gets worse though. By April 2021, it was 140% increase. So we know, I'm assuming this group knows, extremists thrive on moments of crisis. So for white supremacists in particular, their ideology is premised on the notion that a race war is coming. Crises are moments when we typically see these actors exploiting high levels of fear, anxiety in society, and they turn that into opportunity. We know that COVID provided that opportunity. I think we can all now look back and see what a unique year 2020 was in terms of the spread of conspiracies, disinformation, as well as violent extremism. And quite frankly, it was all kind of merging and very fluid and interactive with each other. So recognizing that, Moonshot decided to build on learnings from really decades of offline prevention efforts to see if we could help users while we're all stuck online because we're not able to get out and see real people, see if we could actually do some interventions online and help people with the challenges that they were feeling and experiencing. One of the things that we recognized is that by doing some of this work, we found that violent far-right audiences were 48% more likely to click on self-help and social service content. And users looking to join or engage with violent far-right organizations were 115% more likely to click on self-help and social service content. One of the things that after I looked at this data, I was not with Moonshot when they were doing this. I think that we might have the opportunity to use the online space to actually quickly research what might be driving a particular group and get down to almost a micro targeting of if you're searching for this type of content, you're more responsive to this type of narrative. So let me show you what I mean by this. During the election period, we focused on 4 audiences: white supremacists, armed group members, QAnon adherents, and people consuming anti-government conspiracy theories. We tested 5 messages with them. You're seeing kind of examples of those 5 categories. They were largely aimed to deter individuals from taking violent action. And we used these themes to try to, we used evidence from previous work, a lot of offline work. So we weren't just throwing some stuff together and throwing it out there. We were using that evidence to say, we think this message is going to be most responsive for this community. So we had these messages out there. The positive, let's see, sorry, let me go to the next slide because I was getting ahead of myself. Okay, so during the 4-month period that we did this, 105 million impressions, which is actually a pretty significant number for us. 1 million clicks, even the retweet number, that 8,100, what that means is that somebody that was searching for harmful content was, they liked what popped up. And maybe I should explain how we run the campaigns first. So basically, when you search how to join ISIS or how to join the KKK, there's an ad that pops up, just like you were going to, need to buy uniform school shoes for my kids. You get Google ads, right? Same concept. So we co-designed a methodology with Google to repurpose commercial advertising for social good. So we're reaching out to people at risk, searching for terms that we've predefined. It ran on Google search, Google display, YouTube, and Twitter. And the advertisements would only reach people searching for, watching, or engaging with the content that we were targeting. So if you're reaching somebody that's searching for, how to join the KKK, and whatever message you're offering them, they're retweeting, that's actually a pretty significant finding for us. The audiences, we're focusing on behavioral driven activity, not individuals, not demographics. And then let me show you some of the results. So we set up a hotline in partnership with the crisis text line. It was offered to more than 270,000 high-risk users during the January 6th DC violence. We had a total of over 70,000 engagements with this campaign, and about 15% of users who landed on this text line offering ended up returning on their own record and coming back to receive the counseling services. They are still reporting data to us on like when somebody comes back. And so think about this, like we were doing this through about February of last year. We still have people engaging with counseling services from the ads that we ran over 10 months ago. So that's kind of really a fascinating insight. Another thing that we found fascinating, the most engaging ad began with the statement, "Anger and grief can be isolating." So on average, audiences were 17% more likely to click on that message than other ones that we tested. The armed groups audience engaged most with the calm message, which you can see here. We're talking about the calm app you've seen on TV, right? So if you were searching for something associated with Boogaloo Boys, armed groups, the calm message appealed the most to you, which is, I find fascinating. They also identified with the American identity messages. QAnon audiences engage most with empathy, anger ads. Are you feeling angry? You're not alone. Learn how to escape the anger and move forward. So across these three platforms, the calm campaigns garnered the most engagement, nearly 300,000 clicks on Google display. And by far and away, the highest engagement we had was on YouTube, had been a breathing exercise we've run. I'm recognizing the time. I'm going to skip forward to one more thing because I do want to take questions, but just a little glimpse there of some of the work that we're doing and some of the evidence that we're generating that I think can help researchers, but also I hope we can find a way to bring that to scale to actually be able to do more engagement with individuals that are seeking online harm. So last thing I just wanted to share with you, this is something new that we're not fully ready to roll out, but I thought this group might be interested in. We partnered with Lloyd's of London, an insurance company, to pilot efforts to see if we could use our techniques of assessing online activity to accurately assess the risk of offline violence. This is kind of like the holy grail, right? Can you predict based on the chatter that you see online where violence is going to occur and when it might occur? So we did this lab with them and tried to use our techniques and apply it to historical events. And here's what we found. We actually were able to kind of identify where risk, now this is not absolutely predictive, this would be more in the category of, think like a weather service announcing conditions are right for a tornado or a flood. So you might, if you're a police chief or a Homeland Security advisor, having this information like, hey, the online environment chattering about your particular area of jurisdiction, the words that are being used are indicative of this level of risk. So you might make slightly different operational decisions based on that. You might take protective measures or increase your police force based on concerns. So this was some of the results. And then kind of what we're tinkering with is the ability to turn this into more of a dashboard type model. Again, just one, it's not the panacea, but it's one more piece of data that a police chief or a Homeland Security advisor could use in trying to assess the risk that their area of jurisdiction might have at any given moment. So those are some of the things we're working on. I do think to close, I will go back to what I started with. We're in the middle of this moment of transformation around prevention. I have encouraged members of Congress when I was in government. I'm out of government. I've encouraged them all the more. We have to be willing to innovate. We have to be willing to try new things because we haven't solved this problem yet, and the problem's getting worse. I am unwilling to just turn over the next generation to more violence begetting more violence. I think we have to better understand what is driving the propelling people to more acts of violence. And certainly there are other conversations about gun control and other things that are outside my area of expertise, and that certainly are part of that conversation. But from a counterterrorism community perspective, I think moving to recognize that we need to start earlier in the process, get somebody help before they cross that criminal threshold is a key thing that we all need to be investing in over the next 10 to 20 years to try to get after this problem. And with that, I look forward to your questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Newman. Wonderful presentation. I have about 50 questions, but I'm sure the crowd does as well. So at this time, feel free to just type in the gist. You don't need to give me the full question. We just use it for monitoring, and then what we'll do is unmute you. We had a question from Sarah. I don't know if she's still on. She had to jump off, but her question is the following. How does the emphasis on terrorism within DHS affect the balancing of priorities when it comes to disaster response, so within FEMA? Additionally, sort of that balance between foreign and domestic counterterrorism. How does DHS sort of dynamically adjust according to those needs? And I know you mentioned underfunded but I think...
Yeah, no, it's a great question. DHS, I'll go back to what I said earlier. It's an immature organization. It's in need of reform. Some of that reform is on Congress. There's like over 100 committees that have jurisdiction over DHS. That's just unsustainable. And it's about turf and people not wanting to give up their turf. We got to fix that. But within DHS, the proposition of DHS, the Bush administration, which I was a part of at the time, was not supportive of the Department of Homeland Security. It was kind of forced on them. And so when they kind of cobbled it together, there was kind of a big push by a number of conservatives to not add to the budget because they already knew they were going to be spending a lot of money militarily to go after bin Laden in Afghanistan. So there was this deal struck that we will create DHS and it will be budget neutral, which was laughable then. And even 20 years later, it's even easier to see how laughable that was. The other interesting thing that happens when you have a department that's basically told you're going to be budget neutral, what it basically means is all the components are good, and then you have cobbled together a headquarters unit that's supposed to coordinate across, but there's no money for you to have a headquarters. So everybody's borrowed, everybody's detailed, everybody comes from someplace else. And it's very difficult to create a one DHS culture. Now, the multiple secretaries that have tried to lead this, and I, having witnessed it firsthand, you had secretaries in the Trump administration that were trying to continue to mature the department. They were not able to, given the other pressures that they were under with a very unique focus on immigration during the Trump administration. So the answer in my mind is not to break DHS up. There have been some conversations about that. I don't think that's the answer. I do think Congress needs to fund DHS and actually make it, I forget the stats off the top of my head, but I want to say we're the second largest federal agency in terms of people, maybe third in terms of budget. I think Veterans Affairs and DoD outrank us in terms of budget. But when you look at, like, a budgeter came to me once to brief me, and we're like, we're so proud, like we have the least amount of overhead of any department, you know, in terms of a percentage. And I'm like, I'm not sure that that's something to be proud of. That means that, you know, all of our people are exhausted because we're asking them to do 4 people's jobs because we can't afford to hire the 4 people we need to do the job. It means that every time the secretary goes up to the Hill, he's answering, why did you let CBP do that and ICE do this, and how come you're not paying attention to that? And the answer is, like, because you're not funding us to be able to coordinate across the components, and you're not giving us enough lawyers or enough privacy people or civil liberties or policy people or whatever you're mad about. You haven't funded us to be able to do the work that you can get out of a Department of Defense or a Department of State. So there is absolutely a Achilles heel at the Department of Homeland Security. No secretary can do anything other than 1 or 2 priorities. Now that's true in general of a chief executive. You choose your priorities. You can't do it all. You can't boil the ocean. But usually in a healthy organization, there are other executives that are able to run things and move the ball forward. The way that DHS functions, anything that's out of the norm, anything that's a crisis, it literally requires the secretary himself or herself to handle. And that can't be the way that we function. You have to be able to have the people who have the titles be able to actually do their jobs. And right now, DHS doesn't operate that way. So, okay, so with that as a backdrop, to answer the question, you know, FEMA actually does natural disasters extremely well. They struggle when they get asked to help with other missions. So when they get asked to help with surge of shelters at the border because of unaccompanied children, or when they are asked to help with COVID, they have tremendous experience and expertise that the government needs, but they get kind of uncomfortable doing new things. There's probably a number of reasons for that. But they really like to do hurricanes because they know how to do hurricanes well. So what you see is like this cultural, like, oh, we're doing something new. We might get beat up for it. Let's go back to what we finally figured out how to do well, which is hurricanes. And so if there's a critique for FEMA, it's not that they focus on terrorism. It's actually that they love to focus on the thing that they do really well. And a lot of people argue that over the last 4 years, DHS has been so bogged down by the border situation and a president that was wholly focused on immigration, that other threats were ignored, like domestic terrorism, like cybersecurity, like pandemics, you know, all of which, like, DHS is supposed to be able to lead on. And, you know, it wasn't for lack of trying, but you know, there are only so many hours in the day. And if the president tells you the number 1 priority is this, that's where the executive spends their time.
Our next question, and I'm going to wrap up a couple of them in here.
Okay.
In your work with Moonshot, was that sort of experiment or trial with advertisements global or targeted to the US? And I'm going to follow up with the next question, sort of associated. When we look at events like the Christchurch attack and others, it really does seem like there's a global right-wing extremist movement. Are you guys seeing a connection between social media being shared internationally, where, you know, I think that wasn't happening as commonly before?
The right-wing extremism movement is global. One of the challenges the US government has is, once you see that it's global and it's transnational, does that mean we can apply the intelligence community to it? Well, the way that we use the intelligence community to go after foreign terrorist groups overseas, we designate groups. So how do we designate a group if their origin is US based, even if they're global? Turns out we can't. Like if you're based in the US or if you're originated in the US, we cannot use the foreign terrorism designation. So that's one of the big policy arguments is, do we need to redo that so that there's equity across our laws, regardless of where the terrorist group originates, that we're treating a terrorist as a terrorist. There are some pros, there's some cons. It really does deserve a 9/11 style commission to investigate and figure out the right answer, because it should not be done lightly given some of the civil liberties implications. But yes, it's global. One of the things that is hard is that all terrorist movements have increasingly become decentralized. So Al-Qaeda had this strong hierarchical structure. ISIS also had a organizational structure. I mean, they had a flag, right? Like it is very much like an organization, so you can designate. But a lot of these groups or are not even groups, they're movements. And I think part of the reason we missed the rise of it is because we kept seeing these lone actors. And, you know, like you would read an intel brief, it's like, this is a lone actor attack, or the most likely attack is a lone actor attack. And when you say lone actor, it kind of, you start to think, well, this is just random. Like it's somebody that had a bad day or had a bad life and decided to go attack. And you think that they're isolated and not connected to anything. When in fact, while it is an individual committing the attack, they are not alone. They have been heavily influenced, usually in an online context, and maybe not even in a way that, you know, they're talking to the same people each day that they're on these chat rooms, but they are very much a part of a community that is feeding the conspiracies or feeding the lies or inciting the violence. So some of it was the way that we kept trying to apply the Al-Qaeda lens to a different movement that is highly decentralized, but that does not mean that they're not dangerous and they're not a movement. But our laws are not structured to look at movements. Our laws are structured to look at organizations. So that's one of the biggest challenges that we face. And I don't think we're not at all close to solving at this point, but we need to press on and actually solve it. It would require Congress to pass a law. And I think that's part of the reason you don't see too many people coming up with a solution, because we can't get Congress to pass basic things these days. And this is complex and hard. It would require, people actually spending time and debating. And I really would love for the Congress to get back to doing what it's constitutionally mandated to do. But when it comes to really hard stuff, at least in Washington, most people kind of are like, well, we're never going to see Congress act on that anytime soon. And so they move on and do things that they can do, which is unfortunate, because I think we should be having more of a robust discussion about how to update our laws given the threat that we face.
Excellent. Our next question comes from Dr. Daniel Island. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Vella. Yeah, hi, Elizabeth. Thanks for this talk. Quick question. We do some work in our department, related to adversarial state actors, giving a microphone to some of these types of activities.
Yes.
So have you seen any evidence of that, specifically related to the right-wing extremism that you just mentioned, or is there evidence of state actors that are promoting this type of activity?
Yes. Okay, so the simple answer is that yes, I have seen stuff. Let me think about what is public. One way to maybe talk about it is the intelligence community has noted, and the Mueller report noted, that there was active efforts in 2016 to influence the election by foreign adversaries overseas. What the intelligence community noted about 2020 is that the disinformation came from inside the House. So there were actors inside the United States that were coming up with, like, and rather intentionally, this was, yeah, I'm sure there were individuals who genuinely believe some of the conspiracy theories or things that they were promoting that then went viral. But there were also individuals whose aim might have a variety of purposes, but they would see a news event happen, and then you could watch them have chats about, like, okay, we're going to take this and frame it this way and spread it on these platforms. And then, and it goes viral that way. Like, so there was an intentionality about it. And a lot of that was happening here in the United States, and foreign adversaries were amplifying it. So we were seeing more disinformation happen from inside, amplify from outside. When it comes to the right-wing extremism space, and there's fluidity here, right? Like right-wing extremists traffic in conspiracy theories. We were seeing them take advantage of COVID, take advantage of the George Floyd protests, take advantage of an election polarized, very heightened experience we were all having as Americans, and taking advantage of that, sowing fear and rage, and using that to recruit. And they're more, I think we often think, your crazy uncle that comes to Thanksgiving and says the racist thing, and you just are like, gosh, like, man, you're backwoods. You just don't know what you're talking about. That's inappropriate. You shouldn't say that. But like, that is not who these people are. They're extremely intelligent. They are organized. They are intentionally trying to recruit, but they are not obvious in how they do it. And they share tips on how to, don't go at somebody straight and say, tell them like something that might turn them off. Like you have to like walk them down a pathway before you expose them to some of the things that they believe. So they're very sophisticated in how they do it. And I think we often don't give them enough credit as an adversary for some of their techniques. So anyway, I guess the way I'm trying to answer this is there are things that the intelligence community has been very public about in the election security context that I think also apply in some of these other violent extremist groups. Because remember what the intelligence community has told us, that the aim of Russia and probably Iran and China, but really, heavily Russia, they are trying to sow discord and create societal conflict so that we are so focused internally, we cannot oppose their aims externally. So they could care, like, clearly some of them wanted Trump to win, and some, like Iran wanted to punish Trump. They wanted, so sure, they have their aims, but some of this is just like, isn't it great that the United States is just defeating itself and they're just so focused on tearing each other apart? We don't even have to do it anymore. And they're amplifying it and supporting groups that are helping increase the polarization and increase that social discord.
Excellent. All right, our next question will come from Ravi. Actually, we were having a discussion because we read your abstract. And one thing that stood out to our students was you had mentioned Buddhist extremists. And, I think typically we always think as Buddhist is very peaceful. But then we see what's happening in Myanmar and whatnot. And obviously that maybe that sort of homogeneous view we have might not be quite as accurate as we'd like to think. So I'm going to have Rafi unmute himself and go ahead and ask his question.
Hi, Ms. Newman. Thanks for this wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. Talking about this right-wing extremism, I'm particularly interested about this religious-based right-wing extremism on the South Asia and Southeast Asia. One of the topics you mentioned in your bio as well, like Buddhist extremism, that really interested me. And to add another point, there is also like a Hindu nationalist extremism in South Asia. So is there anything that Moonshot doing about it? Like, can you give us some information on it?
So I can share a little, but I can direct you to some resources. I'm happy to get you more. Sorry, my dog is barking at somebody, so I'm trying to control her. But I was stunned too when I joined and found out like we were encountering Buddhist extremism. I was like, does that exist? Is that a thing? Like, aren't those contradictory terms? But yes, a lot of the work that we do is funded by the State Department or USAID or the UN to help communities in other parts of the world that are also struggling with disinformation and conspiracy theories. The same problem we all have, we're all on our phones now, and radicalization is just happening faster and faster. Like one of the things we recently did was pilot a game in Indonesia that the purpose is to develop media literacy, but it's to counter a lot of disinformation that was happening in Indonesia. And the work we did ended up going to a contest in Paris, like the Tech Against Terrorism type conference. And I'm totally botching that name, but I'll send you some information on it because every day I've been with Moonshot for like 4 months, and every day I learn something new that they're working on, and it's really kind of fun. Some things we try and it doesn't work, but the things that we are innovating around, where you see results, and you're like, wow, that's a real person whose life was improved. And you never know, and with prevention, if you actually stopped an attack, like that's, especially when you're working this far upstream, it's really hard to be able to calibrate and know like who was actually going to mobilize to violence and who wasn't. But if we can make the online space a safer place and encourage civility, encourage people to educate themselves before they believe what they read, all of those are good things, and starting to maybe slightly balance out the power that social media has over our lives, that right now we're seeing mostly, I would say, negative effects societally.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ms. Newman.
I think we have 2 more questions, and one of them is almost a direct follow-up to what you mentioned. How do we measure the effectiveness of prevention efforts? Right. So I think that's one of the big questions we have at NCITE, but I think just, I'm sure arguing your case for the work that you guys are doing.
Yeah. So there was the conference Eradicate Hate this week in Pittsburgh, and I was on a panel that closed it out, and the person that was moderating is from I want to say Carnegie Mellon, and they do a lot of research too. And so her question for us was like, what research questions do you want to have asked? And mine is, I want longitudinal studies. The federal government does not do long-term studies very frequently. Like there are some examples where they are studying crime patterns, in certain geographies over a 40-year period, or education over a 40-year period. But beyond like health and education and crime, like you don't see the federal government invest in, okay, you intervened with this person successfully, that you move them off of the program. What happens in 2 years? What happens in 5 years? What happens in 10 years? We really need to know that. Just kind of selfishly, I really think what we have designed in this prevention capability it's in the DHS strategy, but it's really more, it's so far beyond DHS. If we can implement this, I really do think it helps us reduce the culture of violence in our country. But 10 years from now, we may have actually been successful, but if we don't have the data to show the budgeters, guess what happens in Washington? Budgets get cut, state budgets get cut, and we just end up in this do loop of like, oh my gosh, look at, like, there's an increase in attacks. I wonder why that's happening. Well, because you cut the budget 5 years ago, and like we were actually doing some good. So selfishly, I really want those studies to be there, because I do think that this will work. But I'm also willing to say, like, this is about innovating and trying something new, and maybe we'll find that it doesn't work. And let's find that sooner rather than later, so we can invest in something else. The last thing I would love to see studied is the effectiveness, depending on who is the primary coordinator. Does it matter if you're the coordinator of your prevention capability is the University of Denver, like it is in Colorado, or a law enforcement department. Is there different effectiveness or better outcomes based on who's at the table? So we're so early on in this effort. I think there's lots of room to try different things and be able to measure effectiveness of these prevention capabilities.
All right, so our next question is going to come from Charles. Charles, if you could unmute yourself.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I just want to follow up on what you said regarding culture. And to me, it's very difficult and complex and might even be dangerous to have a single culture in a multi-function agency. For example, terrorists want to destroy America. Immigrants are willing to lose their life to come to America and be part of America, and they want to be part of America. People who have been victims of, let's say, disaster want America to work for them, to rescue them. So you have here multiple goals, multiple expectations from the people. So having one culture might lead into the improper treatment of different segments of the population. The other question that I want to just mention very briefly, and I'll try to send to you via Dr. Vela, it's how do you measure effectiveness? And I've done some work on this area before. And in fact, I did some work on how to measure the effectiveness of the vaccination that was presented to the White House. So, but it's a similar type of a question. I don't have the documents with me, but basically, if you have let's say you have a mission, how are you fulfilling your mission? What are you doing to fulfill your mission? And you ask all those questions that relate to the mission, that relate to the objectives, that relate to different goals that you might have. But I will send you some information through Adam. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm not a researcher, so I very much love when super smart researchers and academics tell me how we should view problems and figure out if it's working or not. On the culture question, I certainly didn't mean to imply that there wouldn't be different cultures at DHS. It's a super huge organization. Probably the best akin is like at the Department of Defense, you have different services, and then each of those services have very unique, very special traditions and cultures that are should be embraced. And there's like even a rivalry there, right? If you've ever seen a Marine, talk about how they're better than the Army, that kind of stuff. So that's all great. It's much more about at the headquarters level. There's not a unity of effort yet. And we're working towards that, but we have a ways to go.
Can I want to ask a quick follow-up to that. Traditionally, counterterrorism studies have been mostly apolitical. Is there some concern that that's not so much the case, given what we saw on January 6th and sort of some of the domestic violence that we've seen?
Yeah, I mean, January 6th is such a game changer, I think, for the counterterrorism community. And you find a lot of us going like, sorry about the dog, by the way, a do no harm approach, right? Like, so when you think about what happened on January 6th, like, hey, that meets the definition of terrorism. I mean, their intent was political intimidation, and they committed acts, in certain circumstances, committed acts of violence in the name of their political aim. It meets the definition. Does that help us? Does that help us de-radicalize? Does that help us, or maybe de-radicalize, but stop further radicalization? Maybe not. It's tough. And I've watched, with admiration, the Biden administration kind of walk this very tightrope line of like, being strong, like we are going to push back against domestic terrorism. It is wrong. It is evil. We do not use violence to achieve our ideology, right? Like, at the same time, I feel that they recognize that if they are not careful with their words and their intent, they could accidentally give fuel to the right to that could cause radicalization. So we're in a sticky point right now, and I don't. The other thing that really was concerning about January 6th is 90-ish% unaffiliated, had no ties to any sort of extremist group. They were there because they were passionate. They believed that the election was stolen, and they were passionate about the person that they wanted to be president. But they were also hanging out with guys that were affiliated with militant organizations and people that in their ideology want to overthrow the US government. So when you're like hanging out in the same space, having a shared experience, and then become defendants, right? Literally at times co-defendants in court, it can have a bit of an effect of moving people that were otherwise what we consider a mainstream to the extreme. And so that I don't know that we can assess that fully in the moment. I think it's one of those things that we look back and see if that actually happened. That's something I'm fascinated by.
Excellent. Okay, so we've gone well over our 1 hour, but I think it speaks to the enjoyment of, or not enjoyment, but the interest that we have here. We had lots of good questions, and there are actually more, but we're gonna hold off. With that, I want to thank you for speaking, and I want to encourage everybody to actually swing by next week. We're going to have Dr. Stephen Smith from MIT Lincoln Laboratory talking about the reconnaissance of influence operations. And this is sort of like a big data, machine learning, AI type presentation. So very technical, should be sort of fun for those of you who like that sort of stuff. So with that, again, Ms. Newman, I want to thank you for coming to speak to us. We appreciated it very much, and we look forward to interacting with you more. Thank you again. All righty, everybody, we're going to be shutting down. If you missed this, we will be posting it to our webpage, and you can find it on YouTube. All right, see y'all. Have a good day. Enjoy the weekend.